Sometimes, the person who changes your life forever is the one you least expect to meet again. Ethan Carter had built the kind of life most people only dreamed about. At 39 years old, he was the founder and CEO of one of the fastest-growing technology companies in America, a man whose schedule was planned months in advance and whose name regularly appeared in business magazines. Yet on that cool October afternoon, none of that seemed to matter. He was driving alone along a quiet two-lane highway outside a small town in northern Pennsylvania, returning from a meeting he had almost canceled. The sky was painted in shades of gold and amber as the sun slowly drifted toward the horizon, and for the first time in weeks, Ethan found himself enjoying the silence. No conference calls, no investors, no assistants filling his phone with notifications. Just the open road stretching ahead for miles. Then he noticed a car parked on the shoulder. It was an older silver sedan, the kind of vehicle that had clearly seen better years. Its hazard lights blinked steadily against the fading afternoon light. A woman stood beside the open hood, her shoulders tense as she stared into the engine compartment. Next to her stood a young girl wearing a blue jacket and a backpack almost as large as she was. Most drivers passed without slowing down. Ethan probably should have done the same. He had places to be and responsibilities waiting for him. But something about the scene made him ease his foot off the accelerator. Maybe it was the little girl. Maybe it was the fact that the nearest town was nearly 15 miles away. Or maybe it was simply one of those moments when instinct quietly overrules logic. He pulled his SUV onto the shoulder and stepped out. The woman looked up immediately, cautious but polite. "Everything okay?" Ethan asked as he approached. She forced a small smile. "I hope so. The car started making a strange noise about 10 minutes ago. Then it just quit." Ethan glanced toward the engine. "Mind if I take a look?" The woman hesitated before nodding. "Sure. At this point, I'd appreciate any help." While Ethan leaned over the engine compartment, the little girl studied him with surprising curiosity. Most children were shy around strangers, but not this one. She simply watched him as if she were trying to solve a puzzle. Ethan checked a few connections and listened carefully as the woman described what had happened. The issue didn't appear catastrophic, but it was serious enough that the car wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. "I think you're going to need a tow," he finally said. The woman sighed quietly and looked down at the pavement. For a brief second, Ethan saw exhaustion behind her calm expression, the kind of exhaustion that came from carrying too much responsibility for too long. Then the little girl stepped closer. "Are you really good at fixing cars?" she asked. Ethan laughed softly. "Not really. I'm just old enough to know a few things." The girl smiled. "My mom says that means you're old." Ethan chuckled. "Your mom might be right." The woman laughed too, and when she lifted her head fully toward him, the world seemed to stop. Ethan's smile vanished. His heartbeat stumbled, because for the first time, he truly saw her face. And in that single moment, 20 years disappeared. Olivia Bennett. The name echoed through Ethan's mind so suddenly and so powerfully that for a moment he forgot about the car, the road, and everything else around him. 20 years had passed since he had last seen her, yet he would have recognized her anywhere. Time had changed certain details. There were faint traces of responsibility in her eyes and a quiet maturity in her expression, but she was unmistakably Olivia, the girl he had once imagined spending his entire future with. Olivia seemed equally stunned. Her smile faded, and her eyes widened as she stared at him. Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched for several seconds until Sophie looked from one adult to the other with obvious confusion. "Mom," she asked. Olivia blinked and forced herself back to the present. "It is okay, sweetheart." Ethan swallowed hard. "Olivia." Her name barely left his lips above a whisper. She nodded slowly. "Hello, Ethan." Hearing her voice again felt unreal. For years he had convinced himself that the past belonged in the past. He had built companies, traveled the world, and achieved more success than he had ever imagined as a teenager. Yet standing beside a broken-down car on the side of a Pennsylvania highway, he suddenly felt 17 years old again. Sophie looked up at her mother. "You know him?" Olivia hesitated. "A long time ago." Ethan could not stop staring. Thousands of questions rushed through his mind at once. Where had she been all these years? Why had she disappeared? Why had she never answered his letters? Why had she left without saying goodbye? Questions he had carried for 2 decades suddenly felt painfully alive. "I cannot believe this," Ethan said quietly. Olivia offered a small, uncertain smile. Neither can I. The sound of a passing truck briefly interrupted the moment. Ethan glanced toward the disabled sedan. Well, your car picked an interesting day to break down. Olivia laughed softly. It was the same laugh he remembered from high school, and hearing it stirred memories he had not thought about in years. Friday night football games. Long conversations under summer skies. Dreams about futures that never happened. Sophie stepped closer to Ethan again. How do you know my mom? Ethan looked at Olivia, unsure how much she wanted to share. Olivia folded her arms and smiled at her daughter. We went to school together. Sophie nodded thoughtfully, as if processing important information. Then she surprised both of them. I thought maybe you were family. Ethan felt something strange tighten in his chest. Olivia quickly looked away. The reaction was subtle, lasting less than a second, but Ethan noticed it. Before he could think much about it, his phone rang. He ignored the call. Then another notification appeared. He ignored that too. For the first time in years, none of his business obligations seemed important. The tow truck should be here within 30 minutes, Ethan said after checking a local service. Thank you, Olivia replied. Another awkward silence followed. Neither seemed to know where to begin after 20 years apart. Then Sophie tilted her head and studied Ethan with unusual curiosity. Have we met before? She asked. Ethan smiled gently. I do not think so. Sophie continued staring at him. That is weird, she said, because it feels like I already know you. Ethan laughed politely, but as he looked into the little girl's bright blue eyes, a feeling he could not explain settled deep inside him. And for reasons he could not understand, he suddenly knew that this chance encounter was about to change everything. The tow truck arrived 25 minutes later, but Ethan barely noticed the passing time. Most of the conversation had been carried by Sophie, whose natural curiosity seemed completely unaffected by the tension lingering between the two adults. As the driver hooked the sedan to the truck, Sophie stood beside Ethan and asked question after question. She wanted to know whether he liked dogs, whether he could cook, whether he had ever visited Disney World, and whether he was secretly famous because his vehicle looked expensive. Ethan found himself laughing more than he had in weeks. Olivia watched quietly from a short distance away. Every now and then, he caught her studying him with an expression he could not quite read. It was not anger. It was not warmth either. It seemed closer to caution, as though she were trying to decide whether reopening an old chapter of her life was a mistake. When the tow truck driver finished his inspection, he walked over with an apologetic look. Nearest shop that can handle this is booked until tomorrow morning. Olivia nodded slowly. Thank you. The driver handed her a business card before leaving. As the truck disappeared down the road with her sedan, the reality of the situation settled in. Olivia and Sophie were stranded. The nearest motel was nearly 10 miles away, and the sun was already slipping behind the trees. Ethan cleared his throat. I can drive you both into town. Olivia immediately shook her head. That is not necessary. Olivia, he spoke gently. You have a child with you. It is getting dark. She looked away for a moment. Pride and practicality seemed to be fighting a quiet battle behind her eyes. Sophie solved the debate before her mother could answer. Can we please? She asked. My feet are tired already. Olivia exhaled and finally nodded. During the drive, Sophie sat in the back seat while Olivia occupied the passenger seat. For several miles, nobody said much. The silence was not hostile. It simply carried the weight of 20 years that neither of them knew how to unpack. Finally, Ethan glanced toward her. Are you still living around here? Olivia nodded. About 15 miles outside town. You always said you wanted to move somewhere warm. A faint smile appeared on her face. Life does not always follow the plan. Ethan understood that better than most. Sophie leaned forward between the seats. Mom used to want to live somewhere warm. Olivia laughed softly. A very long time ago. You should still do it, Sophie declared. I hate winter. Ethan smiled, but his attention remained fixed on Olivia. There was so much he wanted to ask, yet every question felt dangerous. Eventually, they reached a small family-owned motel near Main Street. Ethan offered to pay for the room. Olivia refused immediately. He expected that response. She had always been fiercely independent. After several minutes of discussion, she reluctantly accepted only after promising she would repay him. As they stood outside the motel entrance, an uncomfortable goodbye seemed inevitable. Then Sophie wrapped her arms around Ethan's waist without warning. Thank you for helping us today, she said. Ethan froze briefly before returning the hug. "You are welcome, kiddo." Sophie looked up at him and smiled. "I hope we see you again." Ethan glanced toward Olivia. For the first time all evening, neither looked away. But later that night, after returning to his hotel across town, Ethan could not stop thinking about one thing. Sophie had her mother's smile. Yet somehow, every time she looked at him, her eyes felt strangely familiar. Sleep did not come easily that night. Ethan lay awake in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the afternoon. Out of all the roads in America, out of all the towns he could have driven through, he had found Olivia again. The odds felt impossible. Yet what troubled him most was not seeing her. It was everything he still did not understand. Just before sunrise, he gave up on sleep altogether and walked to the window. The small town below was quiet. A few delivery trucks moved through empty streets while storefront lights slowly flickered on. 20 years ago, he had imagined a completely different future. Back then, Olivia Bennett had been at the center of every plan. During their senior year of high school, they had been inseparable. Everyone knew them as the couple who would probably get married one day. They spent weekends talking about college, careers, and all the places they wanted to see together. Ethan remembered sitting beside a lake one summer evening while Olivia talked excitedly about moving somewhere warm near the ocean. She wanted sunshine year-round. She wanted a little house with a front porch. She wanted a family. Most of all, she wanted a life built on simple happiness rather than money. Ethan had loved that about her. Back then, neither of them had much. His family was comfortable, but his father was obsessed with success. Every conversation seemed to revolve around achievement, status, and ambition. Olivia was different. She measured people by kindness rather than accomplishments. For Ethan, she had always felt like home. Then everything changed. During the final months before graduation, Ethan had received an acceptance letter from a prestigious university several states away. It was supposed to be the beginning of their next chapter together. Instead, it became the end of the story. One morning, Olivia simply stopped answering his calls. She did not respond to messages. She did not come to school. Within days, rumors spread that her family had moved away unexpectedly. Ethan had been devastated. He wrote letters that were never answered. He drove past her old house more times than he could count. Eventually, he convinced himself of the explanation everyone seemed to believe. Olivia had left and chosen not to say goodbye. It had hurt so deeply that he eventually buried the entire chapter beneath work, ambition, and years of relentless effort. Yet now, after seeing her again, those old conclusions no longer felt certain. Something about her reaction yesterday had bothered him. She had looked surprised to see him, but not guilty. Not like someone who had intentionally vanished. Around mid-morning, Ethan found himself driving toward the auto repair shop where Olivia's car had been taken. He told himself he was simply checking whether she needed transportation. The truth was harder to admit. He wanted answers. As he pulled into the parking lot, he spotted Olivia standing near the service desk while Sophie sat on a nearby bench swinging her feet. The moment Sophie saw him, her face brightened instantly. She jumped up and waved enthusiastically. Ethan smiled despite himself. Then he noticed something else. The mechanic handed Olivia an estimate sheet, and for the briefest moment, concern crossed her face. She quickly hid it, but Ethan had seen enough to know the repair bill was far more than she had expected. And as he watched her quietly fold the paper and place it into her purse, he realized Olivia was carrying burdens she was determined to face completely alone. Olivia noticed Ethan before he reached them. For a split second, surprise flashed across her face, followed by the same guarded expression he had seen since their reunion. Sophie, however, reacted very differently. She ran across the waiting area as though greeting an old friend. "You came back," she said. Ethan laughed softly. "Looks like I did." The little girl seemed pleased with that answer. Meanwhile, Olivia folded the repair estimate and slipped it deeper into her purse. "You did not have to come here," she said. "I know," Ethan replied, "but I was already in town." The excuse sounded weak even to him. Olivia clearly knew it. Still, she chose not to challenge it. The mechanic approached carrying a clipboard. "We found the problem," he explained. "A few parts need replacing. It will take a couple of days before everything arrives." Olivia nodded. "How much?" The mechanic repeated the number. Ethan watched her carefully. She maintained a calm expression, but he saw the brief tightening around her eyes. Years ago, He had been able to read every emotion she tried to hide. Apparently, that skill had not completely disappeared. After the mechanic walked away, Sophie wandered toward a display of snacks near the front counter. Ethan lowered his voice. That repair is expensive. Olivia crossed her arms. I will manage. I did not say you would not. She looked at him for a moment before glancing away. I am not looking for help, Ethan. Maybe I am not offering charity. The words surprised even him. Olivia remained silent. For a second, the tension between them softened. Then Sophie returned carrying a package of crackers. Mom, can we still go to the science fair on Saturday? Olivia hesitated. We will see, sweetheart. Sophie immediately sensed the uncertainty. Because of the car? Olivia forced a smile. Everything will work out. Ethan noticed the disappointment in the girl's face. It reminded him of something Olivia used to do. No matter how worried she felt, she always tried to protect the people she loved from carrying those worries with her. An hour later, Ethan found himself sitting with them at a small diner across the street while they waited for paperwork. Sophie talked almost nonstop. She shared stories about school, her favorite books, and her dream of becoming a veterinarian one day. Ethan listened carefully, genuinely enjoying the conversation. Several times he caught Olivia watching them. There was something thoughtful in her expression, almost as if she were seeing a possibility she had not expected. When lunch ended, Sophie excused herself to visit the restroom. The moment she disappeared around the corner, Ethan finally asked the question that had been bothering him since yesterday. Olivia, what really happened back then? The warmth vanished from her face. She stared down at her coffee cup. For several long seconds, she said nothing. Finally, she spoke. I do not think this is the place for that conversation. Then tell me when it is. Her eyes lifted to meet his. Pain flickered there so briefly that he almost missed it. Some answers do not make the past easier to live with. Before Ethan could respond, Sophie returned to the table. The moment passed. But later that afternoon, as Ethan watched them leave the diner, he became more certain than ever that Olivia had never told him the real reason she disappeared all those years ago. Over the next 2 days, Ethan told himself he should return to his normal schedule. Important meetings were waiting. Executives expected decisions. Investors expected updates. Yet every time he prepared to leave town, something stopped him. The truth was simple. After 20 years, he had found Olivia again, and he was not ready to lose her a second time. On Friday afternoon, his phone buzzed while he was reviewing documents at a local coffee shop. The message surprised him. It was from Olivia. Thank you for helping us the other day. The repair shop says the car will be ready tomorrow. Ethan stared at the screen longer than necessary before replying. Glad to hear it. How is Sophie doing? The response came almost immediately. Excited about the science fair she might miss. Ethan remembered the disappointment he had seen on Sophie's face at the diner. Without thinking too much about it, he typed another message. What time is the fair? Several minutes passed before Olivia answered. Noon. Ethan smiled. Then she added another sentence. We do not have transportation until the car is finished. By Saturday morning, Ethan already knew what he was going to do. Around 11 o'clock, he parked outside the motel. Sophie spotted him through the lobby window and nearly burst through the front door. You came, she exclaimed. You sound surprised, Ethan said. I am surprised. Adults always say they are coming, and then sometimes they do not. The comment was innocent, but it landed heavily. Ethan glanced toward Olivia. She seemed equally affected by her daughter's words. Well, he said, forcing a smile, today I showed up. During the drive to the science fair, Sophie filled the vehicle with nonstop conversation. She explained every detail of her project, including facts about animal behavior that Ethan had never heard before. By the time they arrived at the school gymnasium, he found himself genuinely invested in the outcome. The fair lasted nearly 3 hours. Ethan could have left at any time. Instead, he stayed. He listened as Sophie proudly presented her project. He congratulated her when judges praised her work. And when she earned an honorable mention ribbon, he celebrated as though she had won first place. The happiest person in the room might have been Sophie herself. The second happiest was harder to identify. More than once, Ethan caught Olivia smiling at him when she thought he was not looking. The smile disappeared each time their eyes met, but he had seen it. Later that afternoon, the three of them stopped for ice cream before returning to town. As Sophie sat at a nearby table finishing her cone, Olivia grew unusually quiet. Finally, she spoke. You did not have to spend your entire day with us. Ethan shrugged. I wanted to. Olivia looked down at her hands. That is what worries me. Ethan frowned. Why? She lifted her eyes toward him. For a brief moment, vulnerability replaced her usual caution. Because Sophie is starting to get attached. Before Ethan could answer, Sophie called out excitedly from across the shop. But as he looked at Olivia, he realized there was something she was not saying. And whatever secret she was carrying seemed to frighten her far more than seeing him again ever had. That evening, after dropping Olivia and Sophie back at the motel, Ethan remained in the parking lot longer than he intended. Olivia's warning echoed in his mind. Sophie is starting to get attached. The words should have encouraged distance. Instead, they raised a question he could not ignore. Why did Olivia seem so afraid of allowing him into their lives? It was not merely caution. It was something deeper, something personal. The next morning, Ethan received an unexpected phone call from an old family friend named Richard Hayes, a retired attorney who had known both the Carter and Bennett families years ago. Ethan had contacted him earlier in the week, hoping to learn something about the events surrounding Olivia's sudden disappearance. At first, Richard claimed he remembered very little. Now his tone sounded different. There is something you should see, he said. An hour later, Ethan met him at a small office building on the edge of town. Richard appeared uneasy as he opened a worn storage box filled with old documents. I debated whether to show you this, he admitted. But after all these years, I think you deserve the truth. Ethan's pulse quickened. Richard carefully removed a large envelope. The paper had yellowed with age. Written across the front in familiar handwriting was Ethan's name. He froze. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Olivia's. What is this? Ethan asked quietly. Richard sighed. A letter she left with me nearly 20 years ago. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. A letter? She asked me to make sure you received it. Richard looked away. But your father intervened. The room suddenly felt smaller. Ethan could barely process what he was hearing. My father. Richard nodded slowly. Your father believed Olivia would distract you from your future. He was determined that you focus on college and your career. He made it very clear that he did not approve of the relationship. Ethan felt a chill run through him. You are saying my father prevented this letter from reaching me? Richard lowered his eyes. Yes. For several seconds, Ethan could not speak. Memories collided inside his mind. The unanswered questions. The years of resentment. The belief that Olivia had abandoned him. All of it suddenly felt unstable. With trembling hands, he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter dated just days before Olivia vanished. He began reading. Every line shattered another piece of the story he had believed for 2 decades. Olivia wrote about circumstances she could not fully explain at the time. She wrote that leaving was not her choice. Most importantly, she wrote that she loved him and hoped he would never think she walked away willingly. Ethan read the final sentence 3 times. Tears burned behind his eyes before he folded the letter closed. Everything he thought he knew had been wrong. Every assumption. Every conclusion. As he sat in stunned silence, Richard spoke softly. There is one more thing. Ethan looked up. Richard hesitated. The day Olivia left town, she was carrying a secret she never wanted anyone else to know. Ethan's heart pounded. What secret? Richard shook his head slowly. That answer was never mine to give. It belongs to Olivia. For nearly an hour after leaving Richard's office, Ethan drove aimlessly through the countryside. The unopened questions that had haunted him for 20 years finally had answers, but those answers brought an entirely new set of mysteries. His father had hidden Olivia's letter. Olivia had never chosen to leave without a word. Everything he believed about the end of their relationship had been built on a lie. By late afternoon, he found himself parked outside the small house Olivia rented on the edge of town. Her car had been repaired and now sat in the driveway. For several minutes he remained inside his vehicle, trying to decide what to say. Then the front door opened. Sophie spotted him immediately and ran outside with her usual enthusiasm. Ethan, she shouted. He stepped out and smiled. Hey, kiddo. Sophie stopped beside him. Mom is in the backyard. Before he could respond, she lowered her voice dramatically. She has been sad all day. Ethan felt his chest tighten. A few moments later, he found Olivia sitting alone on a wooden bench beneath a maple tree. The autumn leaves drifted slowly through the air around her. She looked up as he approached and instantly knew something was different. What happened? She asked quietly. Ethan sat down across from her, and carefully placed the old envelope on the table between them. The color drained from her face. For several seconds, she could only stare at it. "Where did you get that?" she whispered. "Richard gave it to me." Olivia closed her eyes. The silence that followed seemed endless. Finally, Ethan spoke. "I read it." Her shoulders sagged as though she had been carrying a weight for years and no longer had the strength to hold it. "Then you know I never left because I wanted to." Ethan nodded. "I know." Tears filled her eyes. "I tried, Ethan. I tried so many times to reach you." His voice cracked. "I never got any of it." Olivia looked away toward the fading sunlight. "Your father came to see me before I left. He told me your future was too important. He said I would only hold you back." Ethan lowered his head. Every word felt like another piece of a painful puzzle falling into place. "I should have looked harder for the truth." Olivia shook her head. "No, we were both young. We believed what we were told." Then Ethan remembered Richard's final comment. The secret she had been carrying when she left town. He looked at her carefully. "There is something else, is there not?" Olivia immediately tensed. The fear he had sensed for days returned to her eyes. She stared toward the house where Sophie was visible through the window. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, Olivia drew a shaky breath. "The reason I disappeared so suddenly was not only because of your father." Ethan's pulse quickened. Olivia looked directly at him, and tears rolled down her cheeks. "When I left, Ethan, I was pregnant." The world seemed to stop. Every sound disappeared. Every thought vanished. Ethan could only stare at her. Then slowly, almost afraid of the answer, he turned toward the house and looked through the window at Sophie. Sophie's laughter drifted through the open kitchen window as Ethan stood frozen beneath the maple tree. Suddenly, every strange feeling he had experienced since meeting her made sense. The familiar eyes, the instant connection, the unexplainable sense that a part of him already knew her. He slowly looked back at Olivia. "Sophie is my daughter?" he asked. Olivia wiped away a tear and nodded. "Yes." Ethan sat down heavily, overwhelmed by emotions he could barely process. Shock came first, followed by regret. Then came something even stronger. Gratitude. Sophie existed. She was healthy, kind, intelligent, and extraordinary. 20 years of loss could not erase that truth. "Why did you never tell me?" he asked quietly. Olivia lowered her eyes. "I tried. After I left, I wrote letters. I made phone calls. Every attempt seemed to disappear. Then months passed. Then years. Eventually, I convinced myself that maybe moving on was the best thing for everyone." Ethan shook his head. "I would have come for you." "I know that now," Olivia replied. "But back then I was scared, young, and alone." Silence settled between them. For the first time in decades, there were no more secrets standing between them. The truth was painful, but it was also freeing. A few minutes later, the back door opened and Sophie stepped outside carrying a glass of lemonade. She smiled when she saw them sitting together. "You." Both looked serious. Ethan laughed softly. "Maybe we were just talking about life." Sophie handed him the lemonade. "Mom says life is complicated." Olivia smiled. "Sometimes." Sophie looked between them. "Well, I think life got better when you showed up." Neither adult knew how to respond. Children often spoke simple truths that adults spent years trying to understand. Over the following weeks, Ethan remained in town far longer than anyone expected. Business meetings were moved online. Schedules were rearranged. Priorities changed. For the first time in many years, success was no longer the center of his life. Getting to know Sophie became far more important. They visited bookstores, attended school events, and spent long afternoons talking about everything from science projects to future dreams. Slowly, naturally, a father-daughter bond began to grow. Olivia watched it happen with a mixture of relief and disbelief. One evening, near the beginning of winter, the three of them stood on the porch of Olivia's house as the first snowflakes drifted from the sky. Sophie raced across the yard, trying to catch them in her hands. Ethan glanced at Olivia. "You once told me you wanted to live somewhere warm." Olivia laughed. "I remember. Do you still want that?" She looked at him for a long moment before answering. "Home matters more than weather." Ethan smiled. For the first time in 20 years, the future no longer felt like something he had to chase. It felt like something he could share. Sophie ran back toward them, laughing as snowflakes landed in her hair. Without thinking, Ethan placed an arm around Olivia's shoulders. She leaned gently against him. No grand speeches were necessary. No dramatic promises were required. The truth was already standing there beside them. Sometimes life gives people a second chance after years of misunderstanding, loss, and missed opportunities. And sometimes the road that leads home begins with nothing more than a broken car on the side of a quiet highway.